The life of Louis Riel. Louis Riel was born on the 22nd of October, 1844, in Saint Boniface. Riel was born to Louis Riel Sr. and Julie Legamodiere, and he was the eldest of 11 children. His family was well known in his place of birth, and they were noted for being strong Catholicists. At the age of 7, Riel would begin schooling, and, eventually, he would begin going to the Collège de Montréal and would begin working towards priesthood. However, following the news of his father's death, Riel would become disinterested with priesthood and would leave the school only a year later. Between 1865 and 1868, Riel would take up odd jobs across the United States and Canada. Riel would eventually find love in Marie-Julie Guernon, and they would even go to the point of signing for marriage. However, Julie's family didn't like that she was involved with a Métis person, and so the marriage was called off. On July 26, 1868, Riel would finally give up and would decide to move to the Red River Colony in modern-day Manitoba. Upon his return to the Red River Colony, Riel would find that the balance in the area was disrupted by an increase in Anglophone Protestant Ontarian settlers. The majority of the Red River Colony was populated by Catholic Métis people along with First Nations people, and so the increase in Protestant Ontarians created religious and racial tensions. The political situation of the colony was also uncertain, as negotiations between the Hudson's Bay Company and the newly formed Confederation of Canada had been wanting to transfer Rupert's Land, which included the Red River Colony, over to the Confederation of Canada. This made the political situation in the colony uncertain due to the fact that the negotiations had not taken into effect what the Métis wanted. Despite this, the transfer of Rupert's Land to Canada still went on without considering what the Métis wanted. William McDougall would send surveyors to survey land for habitation within the Red River Colony, and this would grow unrest within the Métis populace. Riel would make a speech denouncing the surveyors, and later, he, along with a group of Métis, would disrupt the surveyors. Riel would later be summoned by the HBC-controlled Council of Assiniboia to explain his actions. Riel stated that any Canadian attempt to take control of the land would be met by resistance by Riel himself, unless the Canadian government took into mind what the Métis needed. Nevertheless, the Canadian government sent McDougall back to the colony to try and enter the settlement. However, they were driven away by Riel, and Riel, along with a group of Métis, would then storm Fort Garry and take it over. From there, Riel and the Métis people would set up a provisional government for the area, and would declare Riel its president. The Canadian government would continue to plot to overthrow Riel, and would try to gather support to overthrow him. However, there would be a large setback when a group led by Lieutenant Boulton and Thomas Scott would be arrested by Riel after trying to overthrow him. Boulton would be tried and would be sentenced to death. However, he would be pardoned. However, despite this, Thomas Scott saw this as an act of weakness, and would continue to insult his prison guards. Eventually, he would be tried and would be found guilty. Scott's sentence was death, and on the 4th of March, 1870, Scott would be shot dead. Following this, in April of 1870, multiple delegates representing the provisional government would meet in Ottawa to hold meetings with the Canadian government. The Canadian government finally accepted some things that the Métis wanted, and this recognition of the Métis' rights would form the basis for the eventual Manitoba Act. Due to Riel's efforts, the Canadian government would finally accept the new province of Manitoba into the Union. Despite Riel being responsible for the creation of this new province, the Canadian government still did not like his provisional government, and so, under the leads of Colonel Garnet Wolseley, they would send an expedition to try and oust him from power. Despite the fact that they framed it as a peaceful expedition, Riel would soon find out that most of the Canadian militia, if not all, wished to lynch him. Riel, fearing for his life, would flee when they had arrived, and he would escape to the Dakota Territory in the United States. Riel would spend 1 year in the United States, and over that time he would develop a mental illness, leading him to believe that he was a prophet sent by God to liberate the Métis people. Riel would return to Canada in 1871 and would stay in Canada for a few years before promptly being exiled in 1874. During this new time of involuntary exile, Riel became more concerned with religion than politics. Riel would spend his time in and out of asylums during his exile, after he was administered to one by his own uncle. He would begin calling himself by multiple names, including Louis David Riel, Prophet, Infallible Pontiff, and Priest King. Riel would eventually be released from the asylum, and he would find love once again. However, just like his last love, their correspondence would end abruptly. Despite this, Riel would get into another relationship not long after, in 1881, and would end up marrying this woman, who he would have 3 children with, and one that would die in infancy. Riel would once again become interested in politics and begin rallying for the Republican Party in Montana, where he lived. By 1884, he had settled down and would eventually become a teacher. However, despite the fact that Riel had grown a family with a loving wife and multiple children, Riel was still the same old man who wished for the Métis rights, and so, when the Métis came calling for him to help them, he accepted them with open arms. Some Métis groups had moved to the Saskatchewan Valley, where the Canadian government did little to support them, and so they called for Riel to help them. Multiple First Nations groups, who also had grievances with the Canadian government, would come over to hear Riel's speeches and would grow favorable impressions with him. However, support for Riel began to waver when his speeches began to become more heretical. Multiple people warned Riel not to mix religion with politics. However, he ignored them. Nevertheless, Riel continued to make heretical speeches, and would eventually send a petition to the Canadian government, along with suggesting to send delegates to directly negotiate with them. The petition would be sent, however, nothing would ever be done with it, and, by then, many of Riel's followers had already left. On the 19th of March, 1885, Riel would once again create a provisional government, this time the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan. On the 21st of March, 1885, Riel's emissaries demanded that Fort Carleton be surrendered to them. On the 26th of March, a Riel-supporting force led by Gabriel Dumont that was scouting Duck Lake unexpectedly came upon a force from Fort Carleton, and the ensuing battle, the Battle of Duck Lake, resulted in a Riel victory. Due to the near completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, Canadian forces from the west were able to quickly make their way to the territory to fight off Riel's forces. Dumont wished to wear down the Canadian army by engaging in guerrilla warfare. This strategy would see some success, as at the Battle of Fish Creek, it would result in a Métis victory, and it would temporarily halt the Canadian government's assault. This strategy, although successful, would quickly be halted, as Riel would demand that Dumont bring forces to Batouche to protect his so-called City of God. The following Battle of Batouche would see a Canadian victory, and would end in a disheveled Riel surrendering to the Canadian government. Riel, who was now in the hands of the Canadian government, would be tried for treason. Riel would reject his lawyer's attempt to argue that he was guilty by reason of insanity. Riel made 2 speeches during his trial. However, he was still found guilty. However, the jury wanted mercy for him. Despite this, Judge Hugh Richardson would sentence him to death, not for treason, but for the execution of Thomas Scott. On the 16th of November, 1885, Louis Riel, son of Louis Riel Sr. and Julie Lagamodiere, was hung for treason and the execution of Thomas Scott. In conclusion, Louis Riel was a Métis revolutionary within Canada. He was also the founder of the province of Manitoba, and today, the topic on whether or not he's a hero or a traitor to Canada is still quite a controversial topic within the country. Thank you for watching this video on the life of Louis Riel.